You're listening to the Author Stories Podcast, bringing you the story behind the stories and the storytellers.
Margaret White,
Terry Brooks,
Sheena Kamal,
Matthew Quick,
JT Ellison,
Walt D. Williams,
Brad Thor,
Corey Doctorow,
Brandon Sanders,
Robin Mom,
Ernest Klein, Jim Butcher,
Sherwin Harris.
Visit hankgarner.com for archives of all the shows. Today's guest is...
Thanks for joining me again for the Author Stories Podcast, where I bring you the story behind the stories and the storytellers. Today, I'm super excited to have Christina Baker Kline on the show with me. She has an amazing new book. It's new to a lot of people because it's just coming out in paperback. It's been out in hardback for about a year, but with COVID going on and all of that, people are just discovering all the stuff that they missed over the last year. And the Exiles is that book that we're talking about. It's coming out when you're hearing this. It comes out today and in paperback. Go grab it at your local bookstore. Bookstores are opening back up all over the country, and this is a book that you've got to have for your summer reading. It's amazing, and it was one of those stories that will linger with you and stay in the back of your mind for quite some time. I love it so much. I know you are too. Welcome to the show, Christina.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. What a lovely introduction.
well, thank you. Thank you. Christina, we begin each show with the same question. And that question is, what is your first memory of wanting to be a writer or storyteller?
I kind of love that question because, the truth is all of us were born creative. Every child paints, every child writes, every child writes poetry and plays and stories and sings and dances. And then slowly over time, most people stop doing most of those things. And some people keep going. And I think the question is not kind of what's my earliest memory, because I remember having a really creative childhood, but I think most people did, where they drew and colored and made up stories. It's more, for me, a question of why did I continue when so many people don't continue? And I think it's a combination of, for some people, writing novels feels natural, and for a lot of people it doesn't. And I've really come to understand that as an adult. I did an event one time with I was writer in residence at a university in New York City, and I brought a writer to campus. And on the way home from the event, I was with another professor who doesn't write fiction, doesn't write novels. And I said, how did you think it went? And she said, oh, it was good. It was great, fine. But she said, I honestly don't understand why anyone is interested in writing and making up stories. And I actually don't even understand why anyone's interested in reading them. And I just thought that was so incredibly honest and really interesting. And I turned to her and said, Elizabeth, thank you. Because when you do love to read, and especially love to read fiction, and when you write fiction, you kind of think that other people feel the same way, but they don't all. And so there is a specific impulse to write fiction that I think is quite different from anything else.
I think you're right. And I tend to agree with you, Christina, about that. The fact that we're born creative, and it's kind of it's like life has a way of whittling away at that creative spark that makes us individuals and makes us have individual expression and the desire to express that expression, if that's even a term. But looking back, what do you think it was that made you different? Was there anyone in your life that you can recall that gave you encouragement or inspiration? Maybe a parent that encouraged you along the way, or a teacher that recognized the gift in you. Can you trace that back to anything?
Well, I think my parents were encouraging. They were both when I was growing, they were quite young when I was born. I mean, not young for young people, but maybe 24, I guess. And they were young professors, and this was in the late 60s, mid to late 60s, and they were, they were sort of, I guess, for lack of a better word, hippies at the time. They were raised in very conservative households in North Carolina and Georgia. They're both Southern. But they kind of marched to a different drummer, I suppose, and were quite involved in the civil rights movement and the anti-war movement and all kinds of things like that. We marched in parades and things. And so they were open. But I will say that there's something in my personality that I think is inclined to try to listen to the voices that are encouraging me and to slightly tune out the voices that aren't. and every writer faces rejection. That's just part of the business, and faces a lot of, sort of people saying no to you. But if you follow the yes, and I tell my children this, that there's going to be someone who's encouraging, who's seeing what that spark is and where it is in you. And so I'll give you an example of that. And this is such a very slim bit of encouragement. But when I was in sixth grade, our teacher had us write, I think, something creative, like a little short story, and handed it on a Friday. It was sixth grade. And on Monday, she walked down the rows. This was back in the day when there were rows of children in a classroom. And she put each story down and she spoke quietly to the person, moved to the next person. And when she came to me, she said, Christina, I really liked your story. She didn't say I loved your story. She said, I really liked your story. And in fact, I liked it so much that I read it out loud to my husband, and he liked it too. Now, that was all she said, but I swear to you that kept me going for the next decade. I mean, so the fact, first of all, that she had a husband blew my mind, that she went home to him and read him my story, this random man, and that she liked it and he liked it. It was all the encouragement I needed. But for any teachers out there listening, sometimes it's the smallest things that can influence your students. And I just went home and I felt like Mrs. Carey read my story to her husband. Like, that was a really big moment for me. And it definitely made me feel that I had something to say. So that's a small example, but it is really indicative of kind of the way that I would save those moments and treasure them and listen to them and try to tune out the people who were saying that I was not good enough, or that something, that I couldn't be a writer.
I love that. Christina, did you, when you were grown and, go to college and start your life as an adult, did you continue in your belief that you would be a writer and this would be a career that you pursued? Or were you like so many of us that, kind of get sidetracked with paying bills and raising family and all that, and then writing comes back around to them?
Well, I had some encouragement in college. Well, first of all, I should say my parents had no money. I was the oldest of four. I went to college and did work study, and I graduated with student loans, and then I actually went to graduate school in England and had more loans. But when I was in college, just by a fluke, I had taken a class with a novelist, and she didn't even show any interest in me, truthfully. But she did pass my work along to her agency, which was really weird. So I suddenly had an agent at a very young age. I mean, like a junior agent in the agency, but still. And she would call me every 4 months and say, are you thinking about your novel? And I just said, look, Beth, I can't afford to do this. I have to I have to get a job and pay back my student loans. And she said, look, here's what you need to do. You're going to apply to MFA programs and try to get fully funded for one of them. And if you can get fully funded, then you have 2 years to work on a novel, and you can put it off. You can put off the work. You'll defer your student loans. And so I did. I had worked my way through college. I worked my way through grad school. And then when I did get this fellowship to University of Virginia, and had 2 free years to write, I also, held down jobs. But I had part of that fellowship was that I got to teach, which was a great experience because, as I tell my kids who are interested in the arts, your avocation may not be your vocation. You need to have a marketable skill. So I learned to teach at the college level, and I also started I sort of started a business called Writing Works, where I edited things for lots of people, and I was a freelance editor. So I kind of learned to shape a life around writing, even though I was working, and realized, I had to earn money. It wasn't that I got sidetracked so much, although I did later get sidetracked and things happened, but it was more that I kind of realized I was never counting on being able to earn a living at writing. I just knew I wanted to do it.
Looking for a tool to help you visualize your story before the drafting begins? Plot Pens is cloud-based and optimized for any device. There's nothing to download. From the new writer who isn't sure how to tell their story to the veteran who can increase their productivity dramatically, we've had experienced writers lay out a detailed structure for several novels in a series in a matter of a few days. The app takes you through 4 steps of the process: the concept or log line. Make sure you have a solid concept that you can keep coming back to throughout the process. The outline, 12 beats and 3 acts, each has a description of what should be happening with examples. The board, 40 cards. We take the 12 beats and add sub-beats to those, breaking it down even further and being very specific about what should go into each. These also have examples and descriptions. Right. We take those 40 cards and turn them into a to-do list. For a 50,000-word book, it's about 2 cards per chapter roughly. We have a beautiful editor built into the app. You can export your manuscript to a PDF anytime with the click of a button. Let Plot Pens help you visualize your writing project. Use code HANK10 to get 10% off Plot Pens. plotpens.com.
Authors, I have a fantastic new service to tell you about. It's called PubSite. PubSite is a service to help you build your very own website, your home on the web, where you can promote your work and give your fans a place to connect with you. PubSite is a website platform that allows every author, regardless of budget, to have a great-looking professional website developed by the book marketing professionals at FSB Associates. PubSite is the new, easy-to-use DIY website builder developed specifically for books and authors. Whether you're an author of 1 book or 20, or a small publisher, PubSite allows you to build, design, and most importantly, update your website pain-free. No need to be dependent on a designer or webmaster to make a small but costly change to your website. Save the money and do it yourself. PubSite is the best platform for authors because it's a book-centric platform. PubSite was built just for authors and small publishers. Every design, feature, and layout is book-centric. They have customized designs for you to use. It's easy to build. No coding or HTML is necessary to create a stunning, professional-looking website with all the features you want. Get a custom domain name, yourname.com. It's simple to update. You can add all of your books, add a blog and a book tour, sell from any retailer, manage your email list and social media, and even do e-commerce. Build your website with a 14-day free trial, then pay just $19.99 per month, which includes hosting. And we offer packages starting at $499 to set up the website for you. Pub-site.com, the place to help authors find their home on the web.
I love the idea of building a life around writing, so that even though you may not be, sitting down every day typing, working toward that story, you are still immersed in the world enough that the storytelling flame didn't dim. I love that.
Yeah, that's really important. And I had to just be really disciplined about writing my first novel. I did write the first draft in that MFA program, and it was great to have that fire under me to get it done. And so I've had to learn to be very disciplined so that I work and write. And then, now writing is my job and I don't have to take other jobs, but but for many years I did. And, I think that's a good lesson too, that I never counted on the fact that I would ever make a living, and then things changed and I was able to, but it was a lot of years before that happened.
Yeah. Christina, I want to touch on the MFA program for just a minute, because I've talked with lots of people that have been involved in MFA programs, and some of them talk about it in glowing terms. This was the best experience in their life, and they brought away so many tools that they continue to use in their life. Some people say that the MFA program just gave them more time to work on the skills they already have. And some people, and this is rare, but some people, look at an MFA program as something that just completely squashed all of their innate creativity. Looking back, how do you view your time, other than just the way that it gave you kind of pushed the student loans and stuff back long enough to let you get your feet under you? But how do you feel about your time in the MFA?
This is a very good question. It's one I get a lot, and I think it's a very important question for young writers. And for, people go to MFA programs at any age now. I think you have to really carefully calculate what you're going there for. In my case, I never, let's see, let me put it this way. Some people came into the program hoping that they would find a mentor, and then were crushed, when that didn't happen. It rarely happens. It can happen, but it doesn't always happen. And as it happened, the University of Virginia MFA program at the time I went was pretty heavily male in the fiction part. And especially Rita Dove had come in as a poet. She was hugely important and amazing, but I wasn't doing it as a poet. And that male culture at the time was also pretty lax. So a number of the teachers I had weren't, teaching wasn't their highest priority, I'll just say. And so when I went in, I had really clear goals. I wanted to write a novel in 2 years. Now, you're not supposed to write a novel in MFA programs. Sometimes today they're set up for that. I think they should be more. I think publishers prefer novels, and it's hard to get a story collection published. So if you go into an MFA program, you come out with stories, it's often hard to know where to turn at that point, because writing a novel takes so much work and so much time. So I was lucky to have an agent who would call and whisper in my ear, look, just submit your old stories or submit part of your novel and just keep going and don't tell anyone what you're doing. Just work on your novel. So there was that. And then also I was funded, so I didn't come out with student loans. That was huge. And then third, I got much needed teaching experience, which meant that I could then go on and get teaching jobs, which I really needed in New York City. I taught at NYU, I taught at Yale, I taught at Fordham, Drew, and that qualification was really pivotal for me and important. But I will say, if you don't have funding, and if there isn't a teaching component, some MFA programs don't have it, and also if it doesn't seem like you're going to find mentors, then you may be wasting your time and money in an MFA program. Or if you don't want to teach, at all, that might not be the right program for you.
Christina, your new book, The Exiles, is your 8th published novel. Is that right?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
How did you know what your niche in the writing community was? With The Exiles, 8 books in, you're pretty anchored in what a Christina Baker Kline book is. You start to develop a brand, for lack of a better word, and that seems very 2021 speak to say that. But when you're first starting out, how did you know, and how did you kind of settle into what the types of stories that you would tell?
I didn't really at all. And in fact, I don't love the idea of being pigeonholed. I know what you mean about a certain kind of novel that that I write. I mean, I think that my novels are pretty heavily character driven. My last three novels have been set at least partially in the past. My earlier novels were mostly contemporary, although my first novel is set in Tennessee and took place in the 1920s and in the present day too. So I didn't ever think that I was going to go into this and write quote unquote historical novels. In fact, I don't love the term because I think it's a bit of a female ghetto, generally speaking. I've written about it. I have articles about it. But I wrote contemporary novels at first. I was really interested in telling hidden stories, I suppose, and trying to look at calamitous events from many different perspectives. That's sort of the story of a number of my early novels. And in fact, that is still the story of my novels set in the past. It's just that the scale is much larger. So I wrote Orphan Train, which is about this little known moment in American history where 250,000 children were sent on trains across the country from the East Coast to the Midwest over 75 years. And it was the largest social movement in our nation's history. There are over 4 million descendants of these train riders, and it was a labor program. So not many people knew this story, and I stumbled on it when I found an article about my husband's grandfather. And then the next book I wrote after that, so that was my sixth novel. The next book I wrote was A Piece of the World, and it was about Andrew Wyeth, the painter, and the subject of his best-known painting. And that, too, was set in the early to mid 20th century, so same time period, but in Maine. And then, you asked me, how do I know what my next subject will be? I've learned to trust this sort of tingle, this kind of sense I have that a big story that I'm reading about or learning about a big story that not many people know. I mean, I'm interested, as I said, in sort of the hidden corners of stories and of history. And so I read a piece in the New York Times about these convict women and their children sent over to Australia for the pettiest of crimes, essentially as breeders under the flimsiest of pretenses. And I knew it was a big story. I wasn't sure I had any right to tell that story. And that's always true when you write a big story. But I knew I had that feeling, that sort of tingle, and that it would probably be worth following. So I did.
Speaking of the inspiration for books, your newest book, The Exiles, and it's out now in paperback as well as hardback. So go grab your copy today. Is it true that that this book had at least took some inspiration from that great Robert Hughes book on Australia? Was it the Fatal Shore?
Yeah, absolutely. I loved that book. I've read it a number of times. It's the most beautifully written and comprehensive story of the British colonizing of Australia and how that happened. And it's fantastic. But I was fascinated when I read it to discover that only one chapter, it's a 688-page book, and only one chapter is devoted to the convict women and to the Aboriginal people together, one chapter together. And I knew those stories were much bigger than Hughes was giving them space for. And so that was what I wanted to write about. And I went back to Hughes's history as I was writing this novel, and it was very helpful. But I did realize how much he had left out about the other stories.
What's interesting in reading this book is from a modern American perspective, this seems like another world. Yet it's really not that long ago when you start, kind of rewinding history. In the grand scheme of things, this is pretty recent. How do you feel like the story that you're telling here will resonate with modern audiences, and what do you think that we can take away from a story like this into our modern life?
Yeah, well, so much. I mean, for one thing, when I write books set in the past, my goal is to write essentially a contemporary novel about a historical moment. In other words, I want the characters to jump off the page. I want them to seem like people you know or have seen. I don't want it to feel like you're reading some sepia-tinged, sentimentalized picture of the past. I want it to feel visceral. I want it to feel immediate. And I want to catch the reader off guard in various ways by surprising them in the way that life surprises you. So my goal as a writer about the past is to make it feel like you're living in it in that moment. And so I do everything I can to make that happen. I try to write propulsive chapters that move quickly. I dive deep into character to show complicated people who make choices that aren't always in their best interest, perhaps, but also they're flawed, but they also, are sort of trying to do their best, whatever that means. And in the case of the convict women and the Aboriginal people that I write about in the Exiles, I was struck, as I was writing this book and when it came out last year, in the middle of the Black Lives Matter movement, in the middle of all kinds of social turmoil during the pandemic, how many of our human responses are the same today as they were, in the mid-19th century. And so I, for example, a lot of the stuff that is discussed in my novel about women having the right to move in society and Aboriginal people having a right to literally to own property and to move across their own lands, those are all actually being played out in some ways in the news, these days. So I'm with Martin Luther King that the arc of justice moves sort of slowly, but it's ever upward. I really do believe that. And as someone who writes about the past, I can prove it. There are many things that are much, much better today than they were then. But humans are humans. And so we're flawed and complicated, and we hold grudges, and we have prejudices. And I love being able to explore that in the past as a lens through which to see the life we live today.
Well, Christina, one of the great things about fiction writing and novels in general is that we can take very heady topics like we've just talked about and that you've described, and we can view those through the eyes of a character that we can connect with and that we learn to care about and becomes someone that we sympathize with, and it goes from the abstract to something that someone that we can commiserate with, and you do that so great with the character of Evangeline. Where did she come from, and how did you kind of devise this trajectory for her?
Well, when I was thinking about how to write a novel like this, which is quite sweeping and has a lot of parts and takes place over several continents and jumps forward in time, I realized that what I wanted to do was to create a central character who's a kind of stand-in for the reader. In other words, Evangeline is a reader herself. She loves to read. She'd be happy to spend a lot of time reading. She's a governess. She's educated. She talks about books and poems and novels with her father, plays Shakespeare, and so Evangeline is a middle-class person. She's a daughter of a chaplain, and she's never experienced anything like this world that she's suddenly thrust into when she's accused of theft and attempted murder, actually, which isn't quite fair, but it's how she ends up in Newgate Prison on her way to Australia. She everything that happens to her is a fresh shock. Everything that happens is unexpected, and I wanted the reader to feel that. I wanted the reader to be with her, experiencing what it was like for the first time to understand that you're sort of being locked away. There's a moment when Evangeline she's just been accused of all these things, and she's in a sort of a paddy wagon, basically a cart on the way, a carriage, prison carriage on the way to the prison, and she's sitting next to a constable, and it's cold, and she moves closer toward him without even noticing it, and he recoils from her, and the line that I wrote is that a sort of chill. She sort of realized with a chill that it was the first time in her life that she realized that she was about to learn what it was like to be contemptible. And that descent into an understanding that your whole life is changing in such a dramatic way was a great way for me to kind of begin the novel and get the reader into the story. And then you move along and eventually you end up with someone who's super street savvy and smart about that life and is not surprised by anything and has lived through a lot of things. And so my characters, Hazel and Olive, both have been around the block and know what that prison system is like. So eventually you end up with an expert, but at first you start out with someone who's quite naive and doesn't know what she's in for.
One of the things that I love about historical fiction is that you can, like we talked about, have characters that you care about, and that you go on a journey with while learning something about events and places and people that actually happened, actually existed. How do you balance those two things, Christina? The historical truth of events and places and people, while also being a fiction writer who weaves a story in and around these historical signposts, if you will.
Yeah, this is at the crux of writing about the past. I'm determined not to fall in love with my research to the extent that I'm giving a book report, which I think can happen in historical fiction. I think sometimes writers fall in love with the information they've gathered and then they can't let go of it and they just want to kind of show you what they learned. So I've had to be really ruthless with myself to cut out absolutely everything that my central characters don't touch, taste, see, hear, or feel. I write it all, and then I pare back when I realize that I've sort of gone beyond the explanation that I need. And, of course, you do all this research and it's interesting to you, the writer, and you want to share it. So there's always a question of, am I saying too much? Am I saying too little? How much does it take to really get the flavor of the experience across to the reader? But I think for me, less is generally more. I want to give a sense of what a place is like, but I don't want to overwhelm with detail. I'd rather, as I said, focus on the psychology of my characters and let them live in that world without always describing the minutia of what they're wearing and all of that. But it's always a question. It's always a tough one. And so, for the prison scenes, I went to the prison in Australia where the women were held, and they have a museum, and you can actually touch the fabric and see what their uniforms were like, and that was fascinating. And I think, convey that pretty viscerally in the novel.
Christina, when someone picks up the Exiles and gets lost in this story and goes on this journey with you, when they get to the end of the book and they close that back cover, what do you, as the writer, hope that they are left with?
Well, I think even though there's a lot in the novel that happens that's pretty intense, these women survived. They survived. They went through an odyssey. But by the end, I hope that the reader comes away feeling that these poor women from England, Ireland, Scotland, and Wales, these British women who were swept off the streets by the British government in what amounted to a breeding program. They wanted Australia not only to be a penal colony, but to be a real respectable colony eventually. So they sent these women over because Australia was 9-to-1 men to women, and they wanted children. They wanted to breed children. So they you stole a loaf of bread or possibly a spoon, and you were put on a convict ship, sent to Australia. You had no rights. In England, you're at the bottom of the social ladder, and all over Britain, and you can't climb up. And there are no social programs. There's no welfare. There's no foster care. There's nothing in place to help the poor. So you're stuck. But when you get to Australia, if you survive the trip and you survive the prison, when you get out, there's a lot of opportunity. And a number of these women went on to do really interesting things, become entrepreneurs, become teachers, as I said in the novel, to found hospitals, to do all kinds of things they would never have had a chance to do in England, and to have social mobility, to marry people outside of their social class, to, as I said, to get educated. And so that to me was a really hopeful message. Today, 20% of Australians are descended from convicts. That's a big proportion. And those descendants are really proud of their ancestors. And honestly, they should be. They survived a lot and came through a lot and persevered, and many of them survived.
The Exiles is available everywhere now in hardcover or in paperback. You can also grab it in Kindle edition or audiobook. It's available in every format that you could possibly want right now. Go grab it today. There's going to be links in the show notes of this episode where you can order it from Amazon if you choose to shop that way. Christina, this has been so much fun chatting. If people are just discovering you and want to dig into all the great stuff that you're doing, where can they find you online?
Well, maybe you'll have a link somewhere, but my website is ChristinaBakerKline.com, and it's Kline.
Absolutely. We'll link that up to make it easy for folks to find you. The Exiles, go grab it today. Christina, thank you so much for taking time to come on the show.
Hank, it was such a pleasure. Thank you so much.
Authors, if you're looking for a partner to help ensure that your book is the best it can possibly be, look no further than Pico's House. Crystal and her staff make a conscious effort to be critical yet courteous. They also strive to make the business side of things run smoothly so that you can rest easy knowing that your manuscript is in capable hands. Whether you need beta reading, developmental editing, a manuscript critique, line editing, copy editing, or proofreading, Pico's House is the one-stop shop for you. Check them out today at picoshouse.com to get started.